What's up, everyone? It's Dakota. Welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And with SCGCon Columbus taking place just this past weekend, we kind of have an idea of what the standard metagame looks like with the release of the Foundation set. And this also putting the standard RCQ season in full swing, where we have quite a long time to be able to qualify for those spring regional championships. I'm going to be bringing you 3 decks that I think are the perfect option. These are probably the best decks that you can be playing currently in this standard metagame to hopefully help you qualify for that elusive regional championship, and of course get some cool promos along the way. Of course, before we dive into any of the decks and we kind of talk about the ins and outs, what's going on and what exactly I like about them and why you should be playing them for the standard RCQ season, be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you know when videos get posted. If you enjoy my content, we're going to be focusing a lot on standard, with it being the current RCQ season. Of course, dabbling into the Pioneer and Modern format, as we always do, as well as doing some other fun, longer form videos to kind of break up a lot of that stuff. So if any of that is you, again, please subscribe, ring notification bell, leave likes on the videos. All that fun stuff helps with the algorithm, helps the channel grow, and we can hopefully reach more people for our amazing content. And of course, I'd like to take this time as well to kind of shout out some of the sponsors of the channel. Mana Traders, for one, is a sweet subscription service. If you need to do some playtesting in standard, of course, there's a lot of decks to kind of go over. Arena's a little bit tough to kind of build up a collection. I got you. You can use my link in the description down below to sign up for Mana Traders, get 5% off your monthly subscription, and you can basically shuffle out standard decks as you please. You know, play in some of the qualifier rounds for, you know, the for like moto leagues, for challenges, things like that, and just kind of get your skills up and get ready for those RCQ events. Lastly, I want to shout out some of the things in the description down below. I have a Discord server, so you can go and join over there with the link in the description down below, as well as checking out the Casual Spikes YouTube channel, where we post the podcast episodes. Haven't really got around to doing any episodes. I've been sick and things have been kind of crazy the last few weekends, but we're hoping to get an episode out sometime this week coming up. So be sure to subscribe to that channel so you know when those new episodes go up. And with all the way, let's go ahead and take a look at our first deck that you should be playing in the standard RCQ season. So up first, I'm actually going to showcase Dimir Tempo. This is essentially the Dimir mid-range deck. There is some differences, I think, between Dimir Tempo and what Golgari midrange have to offer, but I think a lot of what makes them good in the format is kind of what combines the two, if you will. And then the blue or the green is just kind of based on preference. I prefer kind of the blue cards over the green cards. I think that Golgari could probably, in a top deck war, you know, if you're just going card for card, could probably close out a game a lot better. I think that the, you know, Annex package plus the demons and everything like that makes it a lot easier to kind of close out games and not necessarily have to attack because of Annex draining your opponent if you control a demon. Of course, like the card advantage is going to be very nice there. But I think Dimir Tempo just gets to kind of play a pretty cool game where I think it gets to lean more toward more aggressive early on and be able to kind of leverage that aggressiveness with some of its payoffs later in the game here. So we see like Spectral Sailor is like a brand new addition to the deck, only as a one of. I could see this being played more just because this deck is very good at kind of hitting its land drops every single turn and being able to use that extra mana towards something. So with Spectral Sailor and of course like Fairy Mastermind, you essentially for 4 mana can draw cards, and Fairy Mastermind has a little bit more upside because you can have each player draw a card, and if it's the second time, you know, during that turn, you're going to be more than likely activating on your opponent's end step. They're going to draw their second card, meaning that you essentially get to draw 2 cards while your opponent gets to draw 1. Pretty sweet here. Obviously, there's a little bit of synergy with like Shieldred. And I think the biggest synergy of all is probably Enduring Curiosity with something like Shieldred in play. Because with this, plus a bunch of the small creatures you get to play, and you get to play kind of this flash threats style of game where, you know, you have Spectral Sailor, flash, you have Fairy Mastermind, has flash, Flood Pitch Drowner, flash, plus removal kind of stapled onto this body. Also being a 2/1 vigilance, you can get an attack with it if your opponent decides to get aggressive, and then you can block with this, or get an attack and then shuffle away your opponent's thing to be able to chip in some damage. And again, just kind of fits in with what Enduring Curiosity wants you to do, which is another flash threat that's basically says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card, and if it dies, it just returns to the battlefield as an enchantment. So it's a very annoying thing that your opponent has to deal with because a 4/3 body is pretty big, and the fact that if you just play a bunch of these creatures out and you just kind of play on curve, you're kind of ignoring what your opponent's doing, you're going to be able to get a decent amount of creatures on board. And once you get a hit in with 2, 3, 4 creatures and you draw that many cards, we saw it from the Esper mid-range decks of the previous standard, but really before rotation, that even when they were just kind of filtering cards, when they would have 3, 4 cards in hand, they attack with 3 or 4 creatures, and they would be able to put a ton of counters on, say like their Rafine or whatever the case may be, that ended up being pretty lethal in its own right. And the fact of like, you just kind of got to sculpt the perfect hand for whatever you possibly need. If you needed multiple removal spells, when you were drawing 4 or 5 extra cards, chances are between your draw step and that many, you were going to be able to find extra answers to whatever your opponent could play. Maybe you were looking for counter spells, maybe you were looking for additional creatures, whatever the case may be. There was a lot of things going on that, drawing a bunch of cards would solve a lot of problems. And this is even better because you get to keep the raw cards. So you don't even have to worry about, maybe necessarily pitching additional lands where you kind of want to keep hitting your land drop. You can end up, holding on to a land or two, and then you end up having like 3 or 4 spells in hand when your opponent is down to like 1 or 2 cards. There's a very good chance that your 6 cards are going to line up pretty good with their 2 cards. And that's where I kind of like the Dimir deck a lot. I think that you can get into trouble sometimes where you don't get paid off for drawing Enduring Curiosity, or even Kaito, Bane of Nightmares. Just having some way to kind of get that card advantage and get an Enduring Curiosity into play. I think that's the huge thing. But I think with Spectral Sailor, Fairy Mastermind, you're going to be able to kind of keep the cards going and then just be able to kind of beat your opponent down with these small creatures and then physically beat them up turn after turn when you're drawing 3 or 4 extra cards compared to your opponent. And it kind of makes the spot removal a little bit worse as well. That's kind of something I pointed out for another deck that is going to be coming up later in this list. I think that the spot removal is absolutely amazing in standard right now. There's not too much mass removal I think going on in the format. We know that like Choking Miasma comes out of the sideboard for like the Golgori decks. But I mean, here you even see in the main deck here, Anoint with Affliction, Go for the Throat, Cut Down being the main sources of interaction for your opponent. This also getting to play 3 steps ahead, and Phantom Interference. I think these two are just like really good options because you can just leave up something like Go for the Throat. And, when Phantom Interference isn't good, then you have something like Go for the Throat. If not, then you can just have Phantom Interference make a 2/2 flying creature, which again kind of fits into the thing of having these evasive flyers or, these evasive creatures that kind of pair well with Enduring Curiosity to kind of help you draw additional cards when, the pay 2 counter spell, unless they pay 2, is able to be paid. So a dead card kind of in the like mid-game-ish, but, definitely fine to, counter your opponent's 4-drop potentially on like turn 5, while also making a 2/2 flyer to again kind of go with the Enduring Curiosity plays that you kind of have available to you. 3 steps ahead as well is kind of a sweet one. You can, at instant speed, make a token of a copy of an artifact or a creature you control. These decks seem to have gone away from the bat. I like Deep Cavern Bat a lot, and I kind of would like to see it more in the main deck. Probably something over maybe some amount of like Tishana's Tidebinders and anything like that, or maybe even like the Shielder and just kind of move them all to the sideboard. But being able to do something like that, you can instant speed kind of disrupt your opponent, gets a look at their hand. Of course, if they kill the creature, whatever, they end up, again, using their kind of premium removal spell on some of these, like, small creatures that, are just going to keep chipping in for damage that eventually they're going to have to answer, versus getting to do it on something like Enduring Curiosity, which isn't even really all that great, or like your one-of Shieldred, Deshaun Timebiters, things like that. So a lot of what I like here in the Dimir deck is the fact that I think in the Dimir versus Golgori, I think if you can kind of leave a few creatures on the battlefield, you are able to kind of get ahead of your opponent. You're able to apply pressure early while they're trying to tap out for, say, their like Archfiends of the Drosses. You're able to, again, play a bunch of these small creatures, get an Enduring Curiosity on the board to where even if you have to trade away like we'll say like a Fairy Mastermind or maybe a Flood Pits Drowner for, 3 or 4 additional cards to then get rid of the Archfiend, I think is going to be a favorable trade almost every single time. I think you're kind of worth spending essentially 2 cards to get rid of an Archfiend, because then that's really a lot of their offense. And if you can keep the demons off the battlefield, then, them drawing an additional card with Annex at the cost of 2 life, where you can draw an additional card for just making contact with your opponent. through your combat, is going to end up kind of favoring you as well. I'm not willing to say if for a fact Dimir mid-range is the better option. I just like the blue cards a lot better than I like the green cards, but with the addition of Llanowar Elves for the Dimir demons, or for the Golgari mid-range decks, make it so you can kind of accelerate a turn faster, which does mean a lot when you can play like a turn 2 Annex off of a Llanowar Elf into a turn 3 Archfiend. So, I mean, it's going to be pretty close, I would say. I don't think you can go wrong with playing either Dimir Tempo or Golgari midrange. Again, I just prefer the Tempo deck. I like what the blue offers you. I really like Enduring Curiosity and a bunch of these small little blue creatures that you can play at flash that you can also dump your mana into to kind of, again, keep card advantage going, keep your hand full so that you have as many options as possible when dealing with your opponent's threats. Because again, when you look at 30, 40 cards versus your opponent looking at 20, there's a very good chance that you're going to end up winning those games. I would estimate like 90-10 or 95-5, and the 5 to 10% that you end up losing is that you end up just drawing literally all the lands in your deck. Like maybe there's one Underground River in there with like 25 other spells and you somehow draw the one Underground River. Like that's just a game that you're never winning, and apparently we're never destined to win anyhow. But in any other, regular scenario stats wise, like you are going to, I would say, be pretty favored, as long as you can keep a full grip of cards going into the mid to late game. And this deck does a pretty good job of doing so. And again, just kind of limiting the effectiveness of those spot removal spells by playing creatures that are just kind of like meh on rate, but they do just a little bit extra, or, they have flash, and that just kind of allows you to, play on your opponent's turn, force them to use mana on their turn, or you get to untap and potentially protect them with some of these counter spells as well if you deem them necessary to be worth protecting. But on that too, I mean, like the sideboard cards are just pretty great too. Like Flash Freeze is a really good counter for like the red and green spells. Just hard no on those. Negate, always just a really good option. Blot Out for like the demon decks and everything like that. Gets around gets around like hexproof, things like that. Aclazotz is just a good kind of like top end card. More Shieldrids, and that's really what kind of brings up the price on this is Shieldred. But aside from that, this deck is awesome. I would prefer, if I'm going to play a mid-range deck or a tempo deck, whatever, I'm going to play Dimir. But if that's not really your style, there are a few aggro decks in the format that I think are very powerful that can kind of abuse the fact that we know that a lot of Dimir decks are going to be putting a ton of emphasis on the spot removal and maybe a little less so on the board wipes. But some of these decks can play pretty well against them, and we're actually going to take a look at another one right now. Here we have next is Boros Burn. I really think if you play an aggro deck that is centered around playing red, I don't think you really go wrong. Mono red's very strong in this format. I think Boros Burn, the mana is pretty good for it, and I think you get a lot of good cards in white that it's worth kind of making that white splash that you don't necessarily have to play mono red. But again, mono red in its own right is very good. Boros is very good. I've seen some decks still playing green red. Green red still seems like it's very strong. There was even a deck that did very well at the SCG Con 10K that was playing essentially all three colors, only splashing the green for Questing Druid. But I don't think you really necessarily need to do that. But I mean, it's free. That's what I'm told. But Boros is kind of the deck that we'll focus on because, again, I think the white is very good in this format. I think there's a lot of good reasons to kind of splash white here. And we see it kind of in the sideboard. We see Destroy Evil. Knight of Grace is just kind of a good card against like the black-based mid-range decks. We see something like more Lightning Helixes in the sideboard, Helixes in the main, Boros Charm in the main, and Shard Mage's Rescue. The point of contention, I think, for a lot of red decks, and I think what tied a lot of them together was kind of the mouse package. And we see one of the cards here, an Emberheart Challenger, 2 mana, 2/2 haste prowess, already probably good enough. It probably doesn't need any more text for it to be very good. I think that's just kind of a good rate on its own. But if you target it with a spell or ability that you control for the first time each turn, you can get some card advantage by exiling the top card of your library, and until the end of the turn, you may play that card. So this, used to be a part of a 3-card package where we would see like the Heartfire Hero, which is kind of the more famous mouse because it just explodes and deals tons of damage to your opponent. And of course, we had the other mouse that I, again, can never escape the name of me. There's at least one card that I can never really remember, and it'll hit me later. But essentially, with all of them, you could manifold mouse. That's what it is. With them, you had like this package of like manifold mouse being able to target one of them, give a double strike. You gain to play cards like Monstrous Rage, which would eventually give your creature trample, meaning that you could just always give your creature double strike. You trigger the Valiant on it, and then you end up dealing massive amounts of damage. But I think the red package has gotten a lot better to where you don't necessarily need to play it. And I think really what makes this better against kind of like the spot removal decks versus just trying to go out for a ton of damage here is the fact that, you don't need to now play Manifold Mouse, Heartfire Hero to be able to do massive amounts of damage. You have enough burn with Bolt Wave getting to be a 1 mana, deal 3 damage. Burst Lightning, 1 mana, deal 2, and then, you can sink your mana into it later to deal 4 damage. 5 mana to deal 4 damage is a lot when you're already dealing, paying 1 mana to deal 2, but it's like the versatility of it versus something like Shock, which is always going to deal 2 damage for 1 mana and never have the ability to spend more mana into it. So definitely a bonus for playing Burst Lightning here. The burn spells, I've seen a lot of people playing Shock and Lightning Strike in here. I think if you end up going towards white, you don't necessarily need to play Lightning Strike. You can just play like Helix and Boros Charm. And I would imagine most of the time you're going to be able to like cast your spells anyway. Or you're going to be able to cast Lightning Helix and Boros Charm as often as you're going to be able to cast Lightning Strike. I think it's going to be, very rarely. I think you're going to have like 2 mountains in play. I'm sure it's going to come up quite a bit considering that there's 9 mountains versus 12 other lands. But I would imagine that most of the time you're going to be able to kind of find a way to have these lands come to play untapped and be able to Boros Charm Lightning Helix on turn 2 if need be. But I think a lot of this kind of brings to the point where Slickshot Show Off is now a really good card in Standard versus, what it is in Pioneer and Modern, where, of course, with like the free spells and the fact that you have a lot of like 1 mana deal 3 damage spells in the format where it made Slickshot really good. I think now that we have things like Bolt Wave getting printed and Boros Charm and, Burst Lightning even, I think makes Slickshot Show Off a more attractive option than playing said mouse package that we were talking about earlier. The fact that you can plot this on turn 2. Turn 3, you can Bolt Wave, Boros Charm, to even give your creature double strike because Boros Charm has 3 very relevant modes on it. It can also be a form of protection. It's kind of why we see Shard Mage's Rescue here. It's like a way that you can play a more favorable color besides green and be able to kind of protect your threats with this and give them a little bit of a buff as well. It can also help out with Emberheart Challenger triggers. This is like a way that early game you can play kind of like these creatures. You can play Hired Claw is going to get in for a lot of incidental damage. Look at him. He also looks like he's holding the shank too. That's really sweet. Monastery Swift Spear and Emberheart Challenger are of course going to benefit from the fact that you're playing a few more spells. So like a third of your deck is just spells. Or non-creature spells, excuse me. Slickshot Show Off also going to benefit from those non-creature spells and more so off of things like, Bolt Wave or just casting a flurry of spells and then ending it with like a Boros Charm to give it double strike to potentially one-shot your opponent. Screaming Nemesis is, I think, a card that I kind of underrated, at least for like the Eternal formats and Standard. This is absolutely awesome. We'd seen it with kind of like these Witchstalker Frenzy style like decks, and you kind of see that more in mono red, to where you can just get in damage with the Screaming Nemesis and then dome it for 5, so then you can dome your opponent for 5 damage and essentially turn your Witchstalker's talents into lava axes for 1 mana, which I am told that 1 mana to deal 5 damage is a pretty good rate. Somebody can fact check me on that, but I'm willing to kind of agree with that statement here. And your opponent can't gain life for the rest of the game, and that's kind of like a spot where people make fun of like the red deck is like you gain 1 life, the burn deck can't win. Of course, by 2024 standards, that is not anywhere near the case, but definitely Screaming Nemesis, if you're really worried about that as those boomer players, then this is going to be a pretty good option for you, because then you could just shock this to then hit your opponent for 2, and then you kind of get like a semi-upgraded shock, because now your opponent can't gain life for the rest of the game. Lightning Helix as well can kind of help buffer your life total against some of the other aggro decks, because gaining 3 life is not nothing in the grand scheme of things. You also get some decent sideboard cards, playing in white. We talked about Destroy Evil is really versatile. Torch the Tower is a nice one. More Lightning Helixes, Obliterating Bolt, 4 damage, creature or planeswalker, you can exile it. Case of the Crimson Pulse is like a way that you can get some extra card advantage going, because after you solve the case by having no cards in hand, you can then discard your hand and then draw 2 additional cards, which means that you're going to be able to then draw a card in your draw step. You're going to be able to make use of 3 cards a turn, I would say. I think most decks are able to do that. And of course, another Screaming Nemesis here. A lot of what I really like about playing Burn, again, is a lot of the spell removal in the format, a lot of what your opponent's trying to do. I think that the Dimir deck, unfortunately, I think lines up a little bit better against the Burn for the fact that, it can counter the burn spells and it can interact with the creatures. Of course, that's up to the pilot to be able to recognize that. And, if they start countering creatures, killing creatures, well, then they might leave themselves dead to a flurry of Boros Charms, Burst Lightning, Bolt Waves, and Lightning Helixes. But, I think I think the format kind of leaning more towards Golgari and it just kind of being split. I think a lot of the time you can get players that are just kind of, playing the removal spells, playing the big creatures. They can kind of play these creatures early on, sneak in some damage there, here and there, and then eventually when they're like, okay, here's my demon, you can go wide enough on the board where you can start chipping in for damage. Your opponent blocks. You have a bunch of these prowess creatures. You're going to be able to send like Boros Charms, Lightning Helixes upstairs, deal 7 damage to your opponent, and then get extra damage on the board from your creatures, to where it might not even matter that your opponent is able to put potentially a quicker clock on you on like the turns and like the mid game, that you're not necessarily dead in that mid game. Plus, again, the fact that, with Slick Shot Show Off, there's turns where you can go Monstrous Rage into Boros Charm and your creature is just going to be massive. We talk about this going up to 5 power from a Monstrous Rage, 7 power up with a Boros Charm. That's 14 damage. You're going to be able to take down Archfiends fairly easily and still chip in or get in for damage. I think that's like 7-8 damage that you end up getting in for just off of that one attack. Of course, your opponent can have a removal spell for Slick Shot Show Off, but we're not here to talk about that. We're here to live Magical Christmas Land. Your opponent taps out on turn 4, they're dead. So that's something to keep in mind when playing this deck. It's going to feel pretty rough, I would say, sometimes, because there's going to be games that you play against Golgari and or even Dimir, and it's just like, man, they had like the perfect removal spell for my creatures, and then had, in Dimir's case, you had counter spells for, the burn spells that I had left, and again, you play like 21 lands, so it's not even necessarily guaranteed that you're going to hit your 3rd, 4th, and 5th land drops. Of course, if you're watching this, there's a very good chance you're going to hit your 4th and 5th land drop and flood out pretty hard. But, there's some nice things kind of going on in this deck. Whether or not this is the perfect build for it is yet to be seen, but we've seen plenty of these red-based aggro decks doing very well in the format, so I don't think you can necessarily go wrong, especially leaning more towards the burn aspect of the deck rather than leaning more into the creatures, which we kind of saw, a lot of creature-heavy red decks versus very few spells, versus kind of like a nice mix of creatures and spells here. So that is our second deck. Let's go and take a look at our last deck. I think kind of bridges the gap between being a sort of kind of a deck that plays fairly nicely in kind of like this middle game to a little bit into the late game, while also still being an aggressive enough deck to kind of put pressure on some of these slower mid-range decks. Finally, we have what I think is the dark horse of the standard format currently, is Jeskai Convoke. I didn't pay this much mind at the World Championship. I just kind of thought that the Convoke decks have always been pretty good, but and there's always been a lot of potential for the Convoke decks. They just never really kind of materialized, right? I think for a brief time in Standard they were very good, but I think just the sheer inconsistency of the deck made at least some players kind of give it pause to actually play it, versus playing something a little bit more consistent than maybe something like a mid-range deck. But I think Jeskai Convoke now is in a very good position, and honestly, like, if Ross Merriam's playing the deck, I can't argue against it. I see a lot of the potential that this deck has to just kind of be able to beat through some of the things going on with the mid-range decks, while also, maybe not necessarily racing the mono red decks, but being better in the late game against some of these mid-range decks versus the aggro decks of the format. So kind of where my thought process is with something like this is the fact that you're kind of going wide in a deck like this. Novice Inspector, Spyglass Siren, they're making artifact tokens when they come into play. Spyglass Siren making a map token, Novice Inspector making a clue token here. I don't even know what this thing is. Oh, I guess Yoshin Frontliner also just being an artifact that you can end up getting back later with Unearth is going to work very well with a card called Gleeful Demolition, which is going to make 3/1/1s if you destroy an artifact that you controlled. and you essentially get them for free off of Novice Inspector. Spyglass Siren, and again, like Yoshian Frontliner is also a card that you're kind of fine with shattering as well, considering that you can just unearth it later for a white mana. But this allows you to kind of go wide and abuse some of the effects that you can abuse when going wide. So one of the ones, and probably one of the more famous like turn 2 plays of this deck, is like playing a Novice Inspector on turn 1, Gleeful Demolitioning the clue token that you make off the Novice Inspector, maybe playing a Spyglass Siren, Ward in the Inner Sky, whatever, some other 1-drop, maybe even Yoshian Frontliner, because this ends up being like a pretty good card to kind of throw into kind of this loop, because you want to be able to attack with it to give your creatures a buff, to then power out a Knight Errant of Eos on turn 2, meaning that you have, essentially 5 1-power creatures in play, to then pump out a Knight Errant, which puts 9 power on the board on like turn 2. And then turn 3, you play your 3rd land. Hopefully you get like an Immodane's Recruiter off of this, and you just end up swinging for the fences in this style of deck. Again, your opponent could probably have some kind of removal, but just like how I like the Dimir deck, where its threats are not ones that you necessarily want to kill. And I think if your opponent knows what's going on in this Convoke deck, they're going to be wanting to use the removal spells pretty aggressively on things like Novice Inspector, on Spyglass Siren. But a lot of the time, too, you can just kind of get them in that case where, they decide, like, I'm not going to do it this time, especially if they're on the draw. I'm just going to see kind of how this plays out. Maybe they won't have it, or whatever. You can kind of catch them in a spot where you're going to kind of want to do the thing anyway. So even if they, remove the Novice Inspector after you play like a Spyglass Siren or Warden in the Inner Sky, like Warden probably being the best follow-up for the fact that if your opponent does decide to kill the Novice Inspector in like the last window that they possibly have to do it before potentially playing a Knight Errant of Eos, you're just going to be able to put some counters on the Warden of the Inner Sky and kind of get a little peek at your potential draw step and see if you want it or not. And again, kind of grow the Warden in the Inner Sky, and this starting to be a potential threat on the board. That's kind of where I think this deck shines a lot, is the fact that you put so many bodies on the board. Then you have these Immodane Recruiter type of effects. You have Case of the Gateway Express, which, when with you going wide, essentially acts as a hard removal spell, while also giving your creatures +1/+0 as long as you attack with 3 or more creatures. And again, kind of with the play that we outlined on turn 2, there's a lot of cases where if your opponent's just trying to maybe go a little bit bigger, where they're like, okay, I'm going to play an Archfiend, and then I'm going to start using my removal spells to kind of start draining you and kind of get some tempo that way. Case of the Gateway Express, you're able to put enough creatures on the board with probably enough reasonable draws to where you're going to be able to kill an Archfiend while also just being able to set this up for next turn, where you're going to have a bunch of 1-power, now 2-power creatures that are going to be able to get in for a ton of damage and really put the pressure on your opponent. Shelter by Ghost getting to be a pretty good removal spell as well. Fine on something like a Warden of the Inner Sky or a Knight Errant of Eos. That's probably one of the best things that you can put it on. But, throwing this onto a token and getting rid of a non-land permanent an opponent controls until it leaves, giving something Ward 2, +1/+0 lifelink. That's just a lot to be putting on to one creature. And again, putting that like on a Knight Errant super early in the game, where your opponent necessarily doesn't want to tap out to kill a Knight Errant because they're still looking at 5 or 6 creatures across from them, and potentially staring down an Immodane's Recruiter as well that's going to be getting in an insane amount of damage, means that you probably have a turn where you can play a Sheltered by Ghost and just kind of tempo your opponent out by taking their 3-drop and then hitting in for a big chunk of damage as well. So there's a lot going on there. Painter Studio / Defaced Gallery. One side for 3 mana allows you to look at the top 2 cards, play them until your next turn. The other side, whenever you attacking creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. Again, just kind of feeding into that aggressive nature of the deck. Where this kind of plays nice-ish in like the mid game, again, when you have things like Case of the Gateway Express, you have Shelter Ghost. Once you kind of have a case active, it's going to make every creature that you have a lot harder to deal with. It's going to hit just that much harder. You have Immodane's Recruiter that's going to be able to make knights later in the game that you can then, play the Recruiter and then give them, some additional power. Knight Errant is going to get you some card advantage. It's just a deck that I think mixes up pretty well, where it's not going to be nearly as fast as I think as the mono red decks, although it does have the potential to have some draws like that. But I also think that it can play a little bit better in the late game from the fact of like the card advantage you're going to get from Knight Errant of Eos. Playing very well against the spot removal, where yes, there's going to be times where your opponent is going to be able to disrupt your turn 2 play of getting a Knight Errant on the board, but you're already committed to kind of putting a bunch of these creatures on the board anyway. So if you have to wait until the next turn to play a Knight Errant Evios while your opponent, again, only has like their choice of dealing with one creature, you're going to be able to get your cards back from the Knight Errant Evios and potentially even put more pressure on your opponent, because again, you have Case of the Gateway Express, you have Deface Gallery, which is going to be able to pump your attacking creatures, Imidane Recruiter. It just kind of puts your opponent in a weird situation where, as long as you don't mulligan into Oblivion, which I would imagine this deck still has some hands that, you know, can produce a turn 2 Knight Errant Evios even on 5 or 6 cards. You know, as long as you don't beat yourself, you're probably going to end up having a pretty good shot at beating your opponent. The mana is pretty good in Standard right now. We have a lot of these lands that are going to come into play untapped early on, and that's kind of when you want them to come into play untapped anyway. The sideboard options are very nice. Again, kind of some of the ones that I like for blue, where, you know, you have like Disdainful Stroke, noticeably no negates in here, but, you know, I'm sure with cards like Destroy Evil, you have like Rest in Peace, more Shelter by Ghost, Urbrask Forge. You kind of have a little bit of everything for all the matchups in the format, and I think this makes it kind of a dark horse in the metagame. Being able to go wide and buff those wide creatures while also being able to buff your one big creature that you can play in the deck, or like your, you know, I guess 8 big creatures that you have in the deck. I'll call Imidane Recruiter big, even though it's a 2/2 in a you know, a deck full of 1/1s and 1/2s. You have a lot of good threats kind of up the curve, and going wide again is going to put a lot of pressure on your opponent's spot removal to actually be able to deal with what's going on here. And while maybe there's a few like a 1 or 2 turn window where your opponent can kind of, again, disrupt Knight Errant Evios plays, or maybe even stop you from solving Case of the Gateway Express, it's going to be very hard to keep you off of it for very long. So your opponent is definitely going to be pretty incentivized to have to use, you know, keep removal heavy hands potentially, which means that they're kind of at the mercy at the top of their deck to, you know, find some kind of action to, you know, once they kind of keep your board clear, put the brakes fully on what you have going on, and then just kind of turning their creatures sideways and getting in, while hopefully, you know, you don't go some crazy line of play where you like Gleeful Demolition 2 times into an Imidane Recruiter and smack them for like a ton of damage, or, you know, something to that effect. But yeah, that is my 3 decks that you should be playing in Standard right now. I think all of them have their pros and cons. I think a lot of them have good ways of attacking the metagame and kind of playing this ABC style that we're used to seeing from Standard decks. But I think the format itself is very diverse. I think there's a lot of good things going on. I think there's a little bit for everyone to kind of enjoy. There's some nice budget options that are very competitive. I think there's a lot of the good decks that are pretty expensive, but if you have a lot of the stuff from already playing Standard, you know, it's not going to be too much of a tax on your wallet. So just a lot of stuff going on, a lot of things I like to see from a Standard format. But, you know, if you made it this far, you know, please leave a like on the video. Let me know in the comments down below what deck you're going to be playing in Standard. I would really love to hear some of your comments, thoughts, opinions, so on. But yeah, that's going to be this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. Again, subscribe to the channel, like the video. You know, it helps out the algorithm. Check out more of the other videos, all that fun stuff. That's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.